All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in this morning. Really looking forward to this morning's talk with Professor David Schmitz. We're excited to provide this early glimpse into the subject matter for these reunion classes. It's a blazing hot summer in Walla Walla, as it is in many areas right now, but campus looks as lovely as ever, and we're so looking forward to welcoming you here when the COVID protocols are lifted. My name is Jason Arp, class of 1994 and part of the alumni relations team. I'm excited to introduce our speaker, but before I do, I'd like to let you know two things. As you have questions, please put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Once Professor Schmitz has finished his opening remarks, he will take questions and I will read them in the order they are submitted. Also, I'd like to say that we acknowledge that the land we live, teach, and learn on is part of the traditional homelands of the Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Cayuse peoples, ceded during the Walla Walla Treaty Council of 1855. We recognize the continued presence and sovereignty of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation on the reserved lands near Pendleton, Oregon, and throughout the surrounding area, and acknowledge their stewardship of this land as we work alongside them today. So let's get started. David F. Schmitz is the Robert Allen Skotheim Chair of History at Whitman College and a specialist in 20th century United States history and American foreign policy. He has taught courses on United States foreign policy, American Vietnam, 20th century US history, the Iraq Wars, and the history of rock and roll. Professor Schmitz has received the Robert A. Fluno Award for Distinguished Teaching in Social Science, the G. Thomas Edwards Award for Excellence in Teaching and Scholarship, a Paul Garrett Fellowship, and Burlington Northern Foundation Faculty Achievement Award from Whitman College. Also, the Arnold L. and Lois Graves Award in the Humanities from Pomona College, and grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Franklin D. Roosevelt Four Freedoms Foundation, and the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Association. His scholarly contributions were recognized in a roundtable, The Scholarship, Influence, and Legacy of David F. Schmitz, Pacific Historical Review, Volume 88, Number 4, Fall 2019. Professor Schmitz is the author and editor of a dozen books and is currently completing the book he will discuss today, the third volume of The History of Whitman College, The Transformation of Whitman College from a Regional to a National Liberal Arts College, 1975 to 2015. He has served his department, the college, and the Whitman community in numerous ways, including as chair of the faculty. Please welcome Professor David Schmitz.
Thank you very much, Jason. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. As Jason said, it's probably very hot where a lot of you are. It's certainly very hot here in Walla Walla. But I appreciate you spending some of your Saturday morning or early Saturday afternoon if you're in the East. And thank you for inviting me to be part of the reunion, virtual reunion. I want to note before I start the valuable assistance in this project from Associate Archivist Dana Bronson. So as Jason noted, the title of the third volume is The Transformation of Whitman College from a Regional to a National Liberal Arts College, 1975 to 2015. And I want to talk about why there was an effort to transform Whitman College from a regional to a national liberal arts college. And why that stemmed from the crisis that the college faced in 1975 and how the new president, Robert Allen Skotheim, addressed it primarily through the professionalization of the faculty and why he thought it was necessary to transform Whitman College. And so to do that, we need to go back to the changes in higher education that occurred after World War II and up to the early 1970s. Those changes presented by the mid-1970s an existential crisis for the college. After the Second World War, the paradigm for American higher education shifted dramatically. Prior to the Second World War, the vast majority of college students attended liberal arts colleges or private universities, including religiously affiliated schools. That was the norm. Thus, the liberal arts colleges were the centerpiece of American higher education Universities with grad programs were built on top of liberal arts undergraduate colleges. So it was the undergraduate college that was first and primary, not the graduate schools. But post 1945 brought dramatic change to that picture. The mass productivity of World War II, advances in science and technology, the economic growth that the war set off and continued into the post-war period, demanded new skills, high skill levels. The GI Bill, which is the common phrase for the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, expanded higher education in the United States dramatically. It provided not stipends for former soldiers to attend colleges, and 2.8 million of them did so between 1946 and 1956 using the GI Bill. But it also provided funds for colleges and universities to build dormitories and expand their facilities. And those that took the greatest advantage of this and were the great beneficiaries of this were the research universities. And those universities developed to the point where the graduate programs were the most important part of them, not the undergraduate liberal arts colleges or the colleges of arts and sciences. State universities in particular were the beneficiaries of this, and the state university systems throughout the nation exploded. And they used the research university as the model for their growth. And so in most states, what were regional normal schools or teachers' colleges became small universities and part of the state universities systems. The driving force behind this expansion was usefulness of knowledge for society, that is, for the economy, rather than a focus on values or a focus on character or a focus on leadership, rather than the transfer of cultural values. So knowledge, the quest for knowledge, put research over teaching at these schools, and new knowledge was the primary mission, not knowledge for its own sake or time-honored ideas or concepts, and the consideration of concepts like truth, beauty, tragedy, and things like that. So by the beginning of the 1970s, then, this transformation had plunged most of the liberal arts colleges in the United States into a crisis. The largest percentage of students were now attending state universities or private universities. Students were seeking advanced science. They were seeking intellectual vitality and the cutting edge. They were seeking innovation. These schools had the resources they had a lot of energy, growth. They had new dormitories, new labs, new libraries, new facilities. And so students wanted that, and young academics wanted that. They were trained now to be researchers. They were trained now to seek that sort of career. And that's where they wanted to be, to work with the best, to be on the cutting edge, to have the resources to support their research and their ambitions. And so there was a real fear that the liberal arts colleges were going to start disappearing. Between 1970 and 1975, over 150 of them did close. And the criticisms were widespread and discussed throughout not just the literature of higher education, but in popular literature as well, in publications like Time magazine and things like that. And the criticisms were that liberal arts colleges were just out of step. The time had passed them by. They had served a good purpose, but now they were an anachronism on the landscape. They lacked the resources. They just couldn't compete with the universities and with the state systems. The faculty were inferior. They couldn't, quote unquote, cut it at the research universities. That they were parochial. in their approach to knowledge. There was no research, so it was all out of date. Right, that the institutions were resistant to change. They were caught in the past and couldn't make the adjustment to the new needs of American society. And they were isolated, therefore, not just geographically like so many of them were, but also intellectually isolated. As one study at the time put it, it was just not idle speculation to talk about the disappearance altogether of the liberal arts college. And the problem was compounded, of course, by the economic crises of the early 1970s, the stagflation, on the one hand, the economy going into recession, and the other hand, high inflation setting the economy. So there were real economic strains on Americans that made the ability to afford the more expensive private liberal arts colleges versus the state university systems a real challenge for the liberal arts colleges. The social unrest of the 1960s and early 1970s and the changes that came, the civil rights movement, the protests around the Vietnam War, the emergence of the women's movement, gay, lesbian liberation movement, the Watergate crisis. Together, all of this challenged the economic foundations and the conservative traditions and social foundations of the liberal arts colleges. And so that was the broad picture. And then at Whitman, there were other problems as well. There were Whitman's own unique problems at the time that compounded these issues. President Donald Sheehan, after a long illness, had died in 1974, and there was acting President Kenyon Knopf. Two faculty leaders, Professors Dick Clem and Arthur Metastasio, both passed away at this time. There were 2 suicides of faculty spouses at this time. The end of in loco parentis and the introduction of co-ed dorms had created a crisis of leadership, and 2 trustees resigned over this. And so most describe the time as a period of malaise, the faculty exhausted from all the upheaval, the college without real leadership due to the death of Sheehan, the changes in the board, and just nobody knowing where and what direction the college was taking or what direction it should take. And this was all compounded by, if we take a snapshot of the college in 1975, we see that it was a regional institution that struggled to raise money. It had not expanded. So whereas even other liberal arts colleges had expanded greatly in the post-World War II period, Whitman College had not. It had resisted expansion and change. It had a very traditional curriculum focused on the United States and Europe. It was composed overwhelmingly of students from the Pacific Northwest that were white, middle class. 94% of the student body was white. The student body of 1,104 in the fall of 1975. It was not selective at all. It admitted 95% of all of its applicants. 15% of them left after 1 year. And the 4-year graduation rate was only 46%. And if you push that out to 6 years, it was still under 2/3 of the admitted students graduating from the college. The tenure track faculty of 79 was all white and 93% male. The school, as already noted, was fiscally conservative and had a policy of no debt. So its facilities were out of date in many ways. And it had, in fact, at times shrunk the size of the faculty in the post-war period rather than expanding it throughout the period the way most schools had. And so the college just didn't have any real sense of where it was going in the mid-1970s and how to address these problems. And that was the situation that Robert Allen Skotheim inherited when he arrived in July of 1975 in a heat wave very similar to the one that we're entering into now, with temperatures rising above 110 degrees at the time. And Skotheim responded to these challenges by setting out to make Whitman a national liberal arts college and to change Whitman by making the faculty professionalized while at the same time maintaining its character as a residential liberal arts college committed to undergraduate education. Skotheim told the cabinet in his first meeting with them in August of 1975, the president's cabinet, that, and I quote, "The future of liberal arts colleges is not clear." In other words, it was unknown what was going to happen. The forces working against them were enormous, and the opportunities and the ways to move forward were difficult. But he believed he could overcome these. He believed he could overcome the complacency, the Great Depression mentality that made Whitman so fiscally conservative and so afraid of expansion. And he believed that he could move the college in new directions while preserving what was so valuable to generations of Whitman alums at that time. And so the decision to pursue the professionalization of the faculty was the route to becoming a national liberal arts college. And so to do that, he had to raise money. And so this was the source of what became in the 1980s, the $50 million campaign for Whitman. He did this against enormous headwinds, both nationally and locally. The famed historian Henry Steele Commager, who had taught at Columbia and then had gone to Amherst, had written a widely read piece in the early 1970s warning liberal arts colleges not to try to compete with the universities and with the state university systems, that they just couldn't. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the ability to do so. To just accept that they were anachronisms and find a small niche to survive in as sort of an extension of prep schools at the higher education level. At a faculty retreat in January of 1976, the faculty, the majority of the faculty argued, including what were considered the top teachers at the school at the time, argued that they didn't want to change, that they saw no reason to change, that everything was fine as far as they were concerned. And if they would just take the type of students that wanted to come to a school the way they were currently operating. And if they didn't want to come, well, that was fine. But they didn't want to change. They were willing to be an anachronism, as one of them said. And so the faculty was not looking for new avenues or new ways to confront this problem of admissions and of the financial picture of the college. Donald Sherwood, who had played such an instrumental role in the 1930s in getting Whitman out of debt and creating a solid financial platform for the college, started in 1976 a study he entitled 40 Years of Balanced Budgets. It was a defense of the current fiscal model of Whitman College of no debt, can't take out any loans and stuff, can't spend gifts until the next year, so you can't budget the current year on that you'll receive a certain amount of gifts. You had to have all money in place before you spent on anything, and that all financial aid had to come out of endowed funds and out of the endowment. This was a shot across the bow, a warning to Skotheim, if you will, not to challenge certain things and not to try to take the college in certain directions. In 1978, in its decennial, accreditation report, Skotheim put forth through that process an argument for making Whitman a national liberal arts college and the professionalization of the faculty. Paul Bragdon, the president of Reed College, who led the review team and wrote the review team's report, rebuked the college for this effort. So Skotheim puts forward this aspirational document, right? And this is the response, that the desire to move from regional to national stature, and the documents behind this were fascinating, but eventually frustrating. The inquiry is intriguing, but seems eventually to become narcissistic and quite possibly unhealthily obsessive. You are very good indeed. Stay that way and become even better if you can. Especially stop the invidious comparisons with Eastern places. Eastern in quotes here. Especially do not abandon the genius of the Inland Empire and the distinctiveness it can bring. To be an outstanding college is a wonderful thing. To be an outstanding college in the Northwest is a special and glorious thing. Right? So do not aspire, do not try to be a national college. Skotheim rejected this. He rejected this. He saw it as the road to the end of Whitman College, that the colleges could not survive without change. It just wasn't possible. All other schools in the Northwest had or were in the process of either becoming small universities like UPS and Willamette, or committing themselves to other types of professional programs or service things, right? And Skotheim wanted to maintain Whitman as a residential liberal arts college, and the only way to do that, in his view, was to bring about this change. And so he continued to push his vision. As he wrote it at the same time, right, building on a long established and secure foundation of educational quality and a tradition of educational freedom, Whitman College proposes over the next 2 decades to bring itself solidly into the first rank of the nation's small liberal arts colleges. Dedicated faculty members who express the teacher-scholar model are central to the future of the college's educational programs. Whitman's mission is to teach undergraduates, but the only teaching worthy of a fine college is that informed by profound scholarship. Right? Whitman, he said, was one of the few private liberal arts colleges in the West. And just as Stephen B.L. Penrose wanted, Skotheim also wanted it to become one of the best in the nation. So he tied this aspiration back to the history and tradition of the college. And so, as I've noted, the centerpiece of revitalization in Skotheim's view was professionalization of the faculty, to allow the college to recruit and retain top faculty whose ambitions were to be great teachers and scholars. And so he had to provide resources to support that, greater salaries. Many faculty were still working harvest in the summers due to the low salaries they were paid. Expansion of the sabbatical program, new positions he wanted to create, merit pay for faculty and things of that nature. He was trying to shift the means to the same ends of excellent teaching and providing a synergy of the two, research and teaching together. Now, critics, as I've already noted, they were there and they continued and they persisted, responded that he was trying to turn Whitman into a research college, that teaching would lose out, right? That Whitman can't compete with the research university, so why try? What would happen to great teachers who didn't do scholarship? Would we just lose them? His response was that no, excellent teaching came as the primary thing at Whitman when he arrived, and it would stay that way, but it would be reinforced and made better, and the whole experience of the students would be better, their educational experience, if the faculty was able to conduct research and greater vitality within the faculty that would come from that. He also wanted to change the curriculum by bringing a general studies program to the college, which he did. He wanted to upgrade student services by providing various different services for the student body, such as a career center, such as a counseling center, and a health center, all things that the college did not have when he arrived. And so again, he wanted to tie it to the past as he moved the college forward. And so the impact was dramatic. The campaign for Whitman in the 1980s was successful, anticipating it would take 10 years to raise $50 million. No other school in the Northwest had ever tried to, or any other institution for that matter, had tried to raise that much money. It was reached, the goal was reached in 7 years rather than 10. The number of tenure track faculty increased to almost to the low 90s, to 94 by the end of the campaign. So new programs or new faculty positions were created, new buildings and facilities were provided. But at the center, again, was the professionalization of the faculty and the change that that brought to campus, and the change that that allowed for expanding the curriculum. Or as one alum, Frances Owen from the class of 13, put it to Skotheim, right? She wanted to see the windows of Whitman College open more to the world. And Skotheim saw that as an apt description of what he was trying to do. The changes that Skotheim brought were then built on very successfully by Tom Cronin in his 12 years as president of Whitman College from 1993 to 2005. He built on and solidified those changes. And it was under Cronin that the college really moved into the position where it was recognized as a national liberal arts college. Under his guidance, there was a more precise criteria for faculty evaluation based on professional activity and publications. He established Perry Awards and other monies for summer research so students and faculty could collaborate. There was some of that going on already in the sciences when he arrived. He expanded that to be available to all disciplines. He brought the first endowed chairs, first modern endowed chairs, but fully endowed, that is chairs that not only did the endowment pay for salary, but it also provided a research stipend to the holder of that. The first of those chairs was the Robert Allen Skotheim chair. I am very fortunate to have held that chair since 1995, and I'm very thankful for that. The Edwards Award was created as a way of recognizing scholarship as well as teaching and the relationship of those. And so Cronin built on this as he also transformed the physical plant of Whitman College, and he dramatically improved in a variety of ways the admissions picture of the college, making it much more competitive and therefore easing the pressure of having to admit almost all applicants to the college. Now, this, of course, brought some new challenges and change always does, and new competition for scarce resources, stress on the traditional problems of where resources should be allocated, and fundraising and what should be the priorities of fundraising. And they're never solved permanently, just as the tension between teacher-scholar is not always solved permanently, but it is worked out over time and by individuals within their own programs. And so the questions of balancing time demands and things like that are all persistent in higher education and at Whitman College. But the vitality and the energy and the quality of Whitman College today stems from these changes, stems from the transformation that Skotheim began. In 2015, Whitman, at the end of my time period of study, Whitman was admitting 43% of its applicants and graduating 88% of the students that matriculated at Whitman. Right. The positive impact was clear across campus and across its academic programs. New programs were developed on campus, a globalization of the curriculum that took place, that started really strongly in the 1990s, much greater diversity on campus in terms of the diversity of the faculty. Skotheim, when he hired Edward Foster as the new dean in 1979, he had two tasks for him, and one of them was to diversify the faculty, in particular to hire women. Women tenure track faculty now are almost 50% of the faculty, and certainly of the junior faculty, they are the majority. Whitman, having had no minority faculty, now has has 7% of the tenure track faculty is non-white, and 10% is international. So on all of these fronts, we see this dramatic change that has come about from this transformation. And again, as I've noted, the centerpiece of this was the professionalization of the faculty. As I've also noted, this was done while maintaining the connection to, and what I see as crucial for the success of this, and that was the commitment to remaining a residential liberal arts college. So putting that experience of faculty and student in a residential setting at the center, and providing greater resources to make that as successful as possible. Skotheim came to Whitman and he understood, which was very interesting because he had been trained. His BA is from the University of Washington. His MA in history is from the University of Washington. His PhD is from the University of Washington. He spent a year at Princeton University before transferring to the University of Washington as an undergraduate. And then he taught exclusively at UCLA, University of Colorado and stuff. So it wasn't until he became provost and dean at Hobart and William Smith in upstate New York that he actually experienced a liberal arts college. But he knew from the literature, and he knew from his own experience of what he sought out in professors, that is the people who were on the cutting edge of their disciplines, that close relationship of undergraduate teacher and faculty and their students was crucial, and that the literature told them that. And so that all the reforms that were constantly going on were in a sense trying to capture something that was the oldest thing in American higher education, what was being done on the campuses of the best liberal arts colleges in America. And he wanted Whitman to reflect that. And so with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to open it up to questions, because there's obviously a lot of this time period that I haven't talked about, and I'm sure people have questions about the impact of this and how it plays out.
Yeah, great. And as a reminder, put your questions into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and I will present those questions to Professor Schmitz, and yeah, we'll take the next little while to do that. So, David, I'm going to start off the questions. The time period that you are dealing with is very much your own time period at Whitman College. And you were at the center of a lot of what was happening throughout this time. In your research and in your interviews, did you ever find yourself contradicting other people's recollections of what had transpired?
Well, yeah, let me say two things on that. First, let me say that I was here for 30 of the 40 years. I arrived in 1985, excuse me. But this is not my memoir. I used all the written records, that is faculty meeting minutes, meeting minutes of the trustees, interviews, the pioneer, various other committee records and stuff. So all the sources, and tried to get as many different points of view to do this, to understand this. So, but there was a time, there were more than one time, but there was one moment where somebody was saying to me in an interview that this was, and I just, knew it wasn't that way. And I sort of tried to gently say, well, I think you're, and so when I got back to Walla Walla from conducting that interview, I went into some documents and I typed up some, and I said, this is from, this trustee meeting of this date, and this is from, and so, these are the dates, and this is the sequence, and this is what, and they were, and I said, and that's exactly how I remember it as well. And so then they wrote me back and said, well, you know, if the written record says that in your recollection, and you're telling me that others that you interviewed, then clearly my recollection was off on this one. So you always have to check, you know, recollections and documents against other documents to make sure, and look for consistency. And then, you know, hopefully if you find a time when, you know, you don't have anything else to collaborate, you know, you either know that this has been a reliable source at all other times, and so you can put trust in it, or you say, well, maybe this one wasn't, you know, maybe you just can't hang any argument on this because it hasn't been a reliable, you know, there have been other times and stuff. So yeah, so you find yourself in those situations where you know, the way people remember, or, you know, they only remember a partial because they were only partially involved, or they try to, but having said that, by and large, I found most of the people that I interviewed, and the people that I primarily interviewed were former presidents, all the former presidents, other administrators, former and current trustees, former students of the college, faculty, both retired and still teaching and stuff. And I found most people, you know, both had very good recollections because, you know, this was such a central thing in their lives, but also, you know, a generosity about them, but also an ability to acknowledge, you know, yeah, you know, we didn't do that right then, you know, so rather than trying to make everything look good, an acknowledgement of where things didn't go as, you know, or they made decisions, or, you know, and then that didn't work out as well as hoped, and so they had to change direction and stuff. So, you know, people were very much willing to be upfront, and with their recollections and with their information.
Great. Again, I want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A tab. If you remember something from your time at Whitman, and would like to have Professor Schmitz acknowledge that your memory was as good as you think, please put that question in. David, you and Keith Barrington taught one of the most popular classes at Whitman College, the History and Sociology of Rock and Roll, which was very much cross-disciplinary. When did and cross-disciplinary is not, at this time, not new at Whitman College, but when did an emphasis or a trend towards cross-disciplinary research and cross-disciplinary teaching really start at Whitman College?
Well, the first real effort at it was Donald Sheehan wanted to have a class in environmental studies, and he asked Craig Gunzel to teach it, who was a new physics professor. And so that was the first efforts through environmental studies to then bring different disciplinary, then in the discussions around general studies, particularly after Foster arrived and Skotheim and Foster were trying to promote this, there was senior colloquium was created, and that was an effort at interdisciplinary at the exit level, sort of, you know, you come out of your majors and meet with students from a variety of different majors and discuss things from different disciplinary perspectives, current books and issues and stuff. And there were some, you know, there were some other classes. So Asian studies was the first of the majors that both, you know, and during the campaign, it was decided that that would be the first sort of, for a lot of logical reasons of geography and stuff, that would be where the first non-Western sort of focus would be of the curriculum. And so an Asian studies program was finally fully established with Chinese and Japanese languages, and then new hires of people. And there was already a historian, David Deal, hired in '69, but then other hires in politics and other places of people that had a specialty. And so that was another effort. But the type of thing that Farrington and I did was still pretty rare, in that you could take it for a history credit or a sociology credit. Nobody, there was no interdisciplinary major or program like Asian studies or something like that that we were in support of. But we were trying to bring both the perspectives. And so we originally started teaching it where basically we taught 4 days a week, and 50%, 50%. Some weeks it would be, one person would be 3 or maybe all 4 days, but over the course of the semester. But then due to a snafu of the registrar's office, they registered 50 for each of us rather than 50 for the whole class. And so we had 100 students. So we changed the format where we each ran our own, but then I would go in and talk to his class at times, and he would come and talk to my section at times. But now you were in a, but the two of us together continued to collaborate heavily on what the readings were, the themes and topics were, and stuff like that, and use that as a way to teach the class.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about the role or the shadow of the trustees during this time period that you've been writing about?
Yeah. So I would say that the trustees have played a critical and very positive role overall in this time period. When Skotheim was hired, Baker Ferguson was the chair of the board of trustees, and he wanted a president that would bring some new energy and vision to Whitman, and he knew that was going to be difficult, and so he made it very clear to Bob Skotheim that he would deal with certain members of the board, and he would be a buffer, and he would help him, and he would explain it, as did Pete Reed and Larry Belaurier, senior staff members who had good relationships with Don Sherwood, with Bert Edwards, and some of the others. And Skotheim knew that the only way he could get money was to raise new money, that they weren't going to take on debt. They weren't going to, aggressively raise tuition or other things. So he's going to have to raise it himself. And so Baker Ferguson helped create that space. And then Jerry Hillis joined the board soon after. He had been on the search committee. He also played a very vital role in providing that. And Skotheim developed a very strong relationship with many of these trustees, like John Davis, who succeeded Baker Ferguson as the chair. And so they gained a lot of support from trustees by working closely with them. And then in the early 70s, when John Stanton joins the board and Rob Ball joins the board and some others, they really start changing the notion. There's actually a literal change of the committee to an investment committee. And so they start being much more looking at opportunities rather than how to conserve resources, how to develop more resources and stuff. And then in the late 90s, they changed the policy where they agreed to take on debt, which allowed for significant capital projects in the latter part of Tom Cronin's presidency. So there was so the trustees have at critical times played a very important role. And then of course now as the Time campaign with John Stanton as the chair of the campaign, and the successful raising of, it was a $150 million campaign that raised $167 million in the end. The trustees played a central role in envisioning that and carrying that forward. So it's been a very important. And trustees have never moved in lockstep. They've been, there's always, there's always disagreements, and there's always, people that, have different priorities and stuff. But over the course of time, a transformation took place on the board as well about what the board's goal and role should be, and then how that has played out. And I want to note that, having said all that, Skotheim said in his inaugural address, and it's up in the memorial building on the Penrose Society, which is the society for people who have given over $1 million to Whitman, the quote that there is still a challenge for Whitman, and that is to create an environment in which greater intellectual vitality can exist in conjunction with maximum personal and social development. And I think that Skotheim said that, in September of 1975, and that really became a guiding idea for this transformation. And I would say that even people had never heard those words or read that on that board were still acting within that, particularly trustees.
Great. Here's a question. It must have been challenging to write a history following 2 books written by another author. Did you follow Tom Edwards' format for drafting the 3rd volume, or did you divert from his format?
So I diverted in some ways not. Tom Edwards had, mine is completely organized chronologically by administration. So the Skotheim years has 2 chapters. David Maxwell has a chapter. The Cronin years has 2 chapters. And then the Bridges years has a chapter. And then within that, various different topics. Tom would have chapters that were just on students or just on social life at Whitman, or, and then he'd have chapters on the presidents, or, so he has much more thematic organization within a broader than I did. And so I think there's different emphases that reflects as well in the volumes. So no, I didn't feel like that was, I had to just do the same sort of organize or the same exact type of book that Tom did.
Great. Are there lessons the college can take from Skotheim's leadership in the 70s as it faces the impending 2026 enrollment cliff? Will rural liberal arts colleges face another existential moment?
Well, it's certainly possible, with the discount rate being where it is and stuff, and the challenges of financial aid. Skotheim has said, and it's in the book, that the one thing that they didn't hit correctly in the campaign for Whitman was they didn't do enough to endow financial aid. And that is just a constant problem of the demand for financial aid versus the amount of resources available, and how much, you can endow. And, every dollar you endow for financial aid is good, but it's never caught up, or can't keep up with the changing needs and stuff. So that's there as a problem along with the cliff. But on the other hand, Whitman, because of changes that began under Skotheim, and then later under Plan 400 at the beginning of the Cronin presidency, Whitman has a much greater reach in terms of its applicant pool. It has a much deeper applicant pool. We saw with, coming out of the pandemic, the depth of the applicant pool, the size of it, and also then, the number of students that have committed to come here in the fall of 2021, which is, extraordinary, over 500. So Whitman has certain advantages over a lot of its competition in that it's just got a more solid base than many other places, and has developed a flexibility around admissions and financial aid that has given it the ability to maneuver as the applicant pool has demanded over the last few years. That's not to say that it's not an ongoing problem. Skotheim said in in a variety of ways, but very distinctly, he wrote it down in the fall of 1992 in a document. It doesn't matter the context, that the recruitment of money and the recruitment of students are the two ongoing things. Everything else takes place in the context of that. What you can do with the curriculum, what you can do with the physical plant, what you can do with extracurricular activities like athletics and things like that. All of that, those remain the two primary, and that is tough because every dollar that goes to this doesn't go to endow this, or so plus being well aware, they saw a cliff coming in the early 1980s and they geared up for it. And while they were making progress on dropping the percentage of admits, and it went back up as the number of students, it was a stronger applicant pool nonetheless. Whitman used to say to itself in the 1970s that, well, it didn't matter that we admitted basically everybody because the students were self-selective. And so only students that knew they could get in would apply. So we were actually, but the fact of the matter is the attrition rate showed that wasn't the case, right? That you were losing, an enormous amount of your student body, every class. And so for that's, now we see that because it is actually a stronger, we don't have the same attrition rate. And so it makes managing these problems easier, not easy, but easier.
Great. You mentioned that Skotheim came in with a plan for a first-year experience. I knew it as core; others have known it as encounters. So, were we the first college to really do that?
No, we were catching up to programs that existed. Columbia University, for example, has long had its civilization class for its first year. University of Chicago had its Western Civ core program. Many other small liberal arts colleges had things. The tension at Whitman has always been the strength of the major versus what happens in the rest of the classes. And Skotheim was looking for a way to create more commonality of experience to bring students with different, with just different interests, whether they were interests for music or biology or history, to make sure that they were interacting and learning from each other, because he believed that residential component was so important. He didn't believe in forcing it. That is, he didn't want to have things like, well, make all students that take the same classes live in the same dorm section or something. And he thought that was artificial, and that just, fell apart. And the faculty tried something like that right before he came, in the beginning of his presidency, and they abandoned it in less than a year. But they wanted to have some commonality, and they wanted to show that he and Foster that even though you're within your major, there are insights that you can gain from other disciplines to help you understand your major program. And so that was the idea, was to give a certain commonality of experience, bring students together who had a variety of different interests into discussions with each other, and to bring the faculty into those discussions as well.
Great. One more question, and then we will let you go. You're studying 1975 to 2015, but you have studied the entire history of the college at one time or another. What president would you say has had the biggest impact on the actual curriculum? Not, Skotheim professionalized the faculty, but came in and had his or her hand the deepest into the actual curriculum at Whitman College?
Okay, I'm going to take that in two parts. I'm going to take the specific, and then I'm going to broaden it out in a slightly different way. So when Whitman was founded, it had a very, it had a classic, curriculum. But in the late 19th century, like so many other schools, it adopted sort of the model of departments and stuff. And so Penrose had the first great impact in that, he set up what is, what we recognize as the disciplines and the structure of the Whitman curriculum. Skotheim had the next big impact by not just the emphasis on putting a general studies program together, but by expanding the curriculum, by saying that one person or two people departments was not healthy. We need to existing programs need greater depth and strength, but also we need to add things. Asian studies being that first effort and stuff, and so sort of breaking what had been pretty much unchanged for over 70, 80 years. And now saying, let's move in. Now there were, as I said, there were discussions around this. There were 4 majors adopted in the early 1970s, none of which survived by the faculty. That were attempts at interdisciplinary majors and stuff, but there just wasn't enough buy-in or enough people to do them and stuff. So Skotheim not only wanted it, but he went out and tried to get the resources for it. And then Cronin was able to build on that and stuff. And so expanding that out then, I argue in the book that in 1975, when Skotheim arrives, it's still Penrose's college. Stephen B.L. Penrose could have walked on campus and would have recognized almost everything. Co-ed dorms would have been new. They were only a few years old by that point. But besides that, it was Penrose's college. It was still the college that he had shaped, except for it wasn't in debt. He wouldn't have recognized that either. I guess Penrose dealt with debt and failed failed capital campaigns and stuff. In 2015, it's Skotheim's college. Whitman is the college that Skotheim envisioned and transformed. That doesn't mean there still aren't aspects, because there are, of the Stephen B.L. Penrose, particularly just the residential liberal arts college and stuff. But it's now, and so they are the transformative presidents of Whitman College. This is not to say that Tom Cronin in the period I'm doing wasn't enormously important and influential, because he was. You just look at the campus. Cronin transforms the physical plan much greater than any other time period in the history of the college, and and that's not his only achievement by any means. But if you're sitting on a bench, thank Tom Cronin. If you're looking at public art, thank Tom Cronin. If you're in the library, thank Tom Cronin. If you're in the Reed Center, thank Tom Cronin. If you're in the Fouts Center, thank Tom Cronin. If you're in the Baker Ferguson Center for Fitness, et cetera, et cetera. So.
Great. I am going to ask you one more question, and it's
Sure.
one that you asked me not to ask you, but I'm going to betray you here. When and where will I be able to buy this book?
Hopefully, at the end of the summer, you will be able to get this book, and certainly it will be available through the Whitman bookstore, which will be the main distributor, I'm sure, of this. I don't think you'll be finding it, listed on, various online sites or local bookstores. But I'm currently reading the page proofs and working on the index simultaneously of the book. And so we're almost there.
That's fantastic.
I don't have a date.
That's okay. Well, we can't wait to read this and see all of your your vast investigation and research. We're so looking forward. And this is not the last time you were going to talk about it. So for those that have tuned in today, watch your email, watch Witty News. We may be coming to a city near you, and you will be able to come and see Dr. Schmitz in person and ask him all of the questions that we didn't get to today. But David, thank you very much for doing this and setting aside this time on a Saturday and making our virtual reunion a success. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye.